Now, rather than leave you hanging with a lot of these theoretical discussions on evolution and the speed of evolution and how it could happen and which way it happens and so on, let me give you some examples. And at the end of this, I'm going to augment these examples with two films. One of them is going to deal with the evolution of whales, and the other one is going to deal with the evolution of dinosaurs from birds from dinosaurs, the other way around. And I'm going to lecture on the latter of these as well. So the business about birds from dinosaurs, I mean, that is something that for some people may just be so preposterous to even think of. We have these little things that are fluttering about, and how could they possibly be related to dinosaurs? Now, if you have in your mind the big lumbering dinosaurs like the large long-necked dinosaurs or the triceratops or those kind of dinosaurs, no, those are not like birds. But if you think about bipedal dinosaurs, dinosaurs that walk only on their hind legs, right? Things like T-Rexes or things like the various kinds of aggressive dinosaurs that you saw in Jurassic Park, right? The ones that are really nasty. What were those called again? Velociraptors, right? Even the name is evil sounding. Well, velociraptors, if you look at the size of a velociraptor and you look at something like an ostrich or an emu or a cassowary, all of those are large flightless birds, pretty mean too, and certainly a cassowary has claws that can really hurt you. I mean, they attack. And so, well, yes, the distinction between a T-Rex and a starling is quite interesting, but very difficult to reconcile. But when you come to something like a little velociraptor and a little cassowary or an emu, that does look a little bit similar, doesn't it? Now, people who were first bringing up this idea, they were looking at a variety of characteristics on the birds and the dinosaurs they found. Now, you have to imagine this. People were, for the first time, finding bones in the rock. And they're going at this and they're saying, what is this? Well, eventually they called it dinosaur and they recognized it as dinosaur, and they found that some of these were obviously bones from very large organisms. And the natural thing to do is to figure out, where does this even belong in animals? Well, clearly it belongs within the vertebrates. Clearly it belonged in a group of vertebrates that was not fully aquatic because they had very well developed limbs, so it couldn't be fish. It couldn't be amphibians either, and based on some of the features they found, they would obviously somehow be related to reptiles. And then when they found additional bones and additional characteristics emerged, they realized that there were some of these bones that were remarkably similar between things like birds as opposed to lizards. This was a conundrum because you have many features in dinosaurs that are clearly lizard-like. Reptilian, certainly. You have scales and you have certain features of hands and skulls and so on, and they would remind you more of lizards. But then when you're looking at all the different kinds of lizards out there, and you're including in your sample not only the lizards and birds that exist today, but also lizards and birds that existed in the past, and you include both adult and juveniles, then you end up with a very large data set, and suddenly you can recognize patterns. Looking at a single dinosaur and a single bird, both of which would be arbitrarily picked, really, you might not be able to see this entire pattern, and for a long time this is what people struggled with. But once you look at all of these features, then suddenly you realize that there is a lot of support for the hypothesis that birds evolved from dinosaurs. For example, if you look at bone structure, if you look at the insertion of muscles and how the muscles produced the bipedal locomotion, that's walking. And then if you add from the juveniles some data about how these organisms developed and how they behaved in terms of nesting behavior, in terms of flocking behavior, you suddenly realize, wow, there are a lot of similarities here. And so one of the things to do is to look at one of these fossils. So here's one fossil, and when people first looked at this, they thought they saw a bird. And the reason why they saw a bird unequivocally was because here in the rock you actually have feathers. Now this was a fossil that was discovered in the 1820s in Germany. It is called Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx has a claim to fame as what people call the first bird. And it's because people recognized it was a relatively old fossil, and way back then this was exciting news. Now, the problem with Archaeopteryx as a bird is as follows. Number one, it's got a tail. Birds don't have tails. They're kind of like us. We have tail bones and little tiny bits, but we don't actually have a tail. So maybe it's a lizard. But then it has a beak. Okay, well maybe it's a bird. But then the beak actually has teeth. Oh, well maybe it's a lizard. It's got wings, so maybe it's a bird. But it's got claws. Doesn't that make it a lizard? So you can see that there are all these conflicting pieces of information. And how do you fit that together? I mean, how do you reconcile something that kind of looks like a lizard and kind of looks like a bird? Is this actually something one might consider a transitional fossil? Well, if it is a transitional fossil, and we're trying to go from A to B, where B would be the birds and A would be the dinosaurs, where exactly does it fit? So it doesn't answer any questions. It points to the connection, but it leaves you with a lot of questions. And these questions were not easily reconciled. It took some time. In fact, it took until the mid-1990s until somebody came up with a really cohesive series of steps that allows you to go from something like a dinosaur to today's birds. It required a lot of careful observation, a lot of methodical literature work to find all the different fossils and piece them together and to come up with this ladder here, which you can't really read, but I'm going to point out a few things to you. First of all, on the left of this ladder, you will see all the different fossils. They're not named with the exception of our friend Archaeopteryx here. That's Archaeopteryx. All the others remain unnamed. But all of these are the kinds of organisms that, first of all, would show step by step how you turn a dinosaur into something like a bird. And in fact, we can do this because we know that all of the species that you see here are known from really good fossils. Now let's take a quick look at what it takes. Let's take, for example, the last step here. It says you need a toothless beak. That's what we would see in birds. Now if you look at the developmental patterns in birds, one of the things you'd realize is that if you look at a chicken embryo, for example, during its development, the chicken embryo develops teeth, and then it loses them. That's kind of like us developing a tail and then losing it, and us developing gill slits and then losing them. We don't need any of that stuff. Well, the chicken obviously doesn't have any teeth as an adult, and so why would it even develop them in embryo? But it does. If you crack open the egg as it develops just the right time, you run your fingers along the chicken's beak, it's got teeth. So who would have thunk it, right? Where did that come from? Well, why would you have the genes that make teeth in an organism that doesn't have teeth. They've got to be left over. They're left over from when things like birds had teeth. All right, well, what about claws on wings? There's another one. Claws on wings. Well, one of the things that you'll see is when you make a wing, you actually take elements of hands and fuse them. Because you don't need little fingers out there, you just need a solid structure to support the muscles, right? And so what you would do is, first of all, fuse some of these elements. Now, if you don't know enough, you may not know enough about medicine to realize that in humans sometimes you actually have fusion of some of these elements. There are people who have a couple of their toes fused, where the toes are together. They're normal toes if you put them through an x-ray, but the skin just didn't somehow separate. The same kind of things happens with hands. There are people who have genetic disorders and their hands are not formed properly. Now, if you do an x-ray, and in some cases you can operate and you can get the proper fingers, but some of the kids, they have skin where there isn't supposed to be any skin. So to turn something from a claw or fingers to something that's a fused set of fingers is just an issue in development. And we see it in humans, and we know how it works, and we know how the developmental genes just don't operate properly. The same kind of thing happens with the claw. There are, in humans, malformations of fingernails. And some of your colleagues and some of your relatives may have them. It's not bad. I mean, it's, some people have tiny little toes, and the fingernails on the toes, or the toenails rather, are a little malformed. So they're kind of a little bit grown into the skin, and they're not almost real fingernails. They just didn't form properly. Bits of them are there, but not the whole thing. And if you look at some of the people on this campus, when you look at their hands, they don't quite have all the fingernails right. So how does that happen? Well, it's another one of those developmental things. It's no big deal, because, I mean, you don't use your fingernails all the time. But if you're looking at forming claws, those genes operate the same way, because claws are a modified type of fingernail. It's the same kind of protein. It just grows differently. So that's not a big deal either. And as we're going through this, you'll realize that every step of the way, there are some slight differences, modifications of developmental pathways primarily, that take you from something that looks like a dinosaur to something that looks like a bird. So we have all the information there now, and this is the kind of thing that people were working on for decades, literally pieced it all together very carefully. Now, of course, one of the things that happens when you do this kind of careful work for many years, you're hoping that somebody else is going to develop another proof, something that allows you to state beyond a shadow of the doubt that what you propose is actually right. That's always nice. And so in 2005, that's when we got some interesting molecular evidence. Now, molecular evidence was because somebody actually had a very innovative idea. When you find a dinosaur, that's obviously a special find. And the last thing you want to do is somehow break these nice dinosaur bones. I mean, you want to keep those really nice and really together. Well, somebody at some point was studying the bone formation in dinosaurs. They were trying to figure out how thick were these bones, and what level of bone material was deposited, and so on. And so with the new technology of things like MRIs and CAT scans, you can now look inside things without breaking them. And so what they did in 2005 is they actually had a hospital agree to this because CAT scans and things are still very expensive instruments. So they brought a big T-Rex femur, that's the largest bone in the body of a dinosaur. They dragged that into the hospital, they put it on the tray, they pushed it in the machine, and they did a scan. And they found, as they expected, all kinds of interesting data on the different minerals that were in there, and they do different things based on how they look in the CAT scan. But they also found this area in the center of the bone that was organic. Now, you might not know this, but if you have a big bone like this, it mineralizes, it turns into rock from the outside in. And with this large bone, they found that a small area had not yet mineralized. It was still organic. Well, that's quite a find, isn't it? Because now you're hoping, just like with Jurassic Park, you might find DNA. And unfortunately, they didn't find DNA. But they found the next best thing. They found proteins. Proteins that we still recognize today. These proteins are a mixture of collagens. And collagen is connective tissue. You have collagen. All vertebrates have some form of collagen. And so what this provided for the first time was an opportunity to study the molecular aspects of the relationship of dinosaurs. Now, clearly, when you're working with proteins, you have to speak the language of amino acids. So you're not looking at the genetics specifically, you're not looking at the sequence of DNA, but you're looking at the sequence of amino acids, which is the next best thing. And so they extracted a little bit of this, and in fact, they've now done it with a variety of these T-Rex bones. They actually started to smash some of these very valuable fossils, or rather extract pieces out of them so that they could do this molecular analysis. And when they did this, and they looked at 7 collagen proteins, they found that the closest living relative of the T-Rex is the chicken. So next time you meet a chicken, give it some respect. This was unexpected, of course, because, I mean, come on, it's a chicken, right? What's the thing with the chicken and the T-Rex? Really? Now, if you do this kind of analysis and you look at the ostrich and the emu and the cassowary and, you know, some other birds, you might say, oh yeah, it could be those because they're mean and they have the heft to be like a T-Rex. But no, it's the chicken. So the ancestor of the chicken is the T-Rex. That's saying something. I mean, who's your daddy, right? I mean, this is something that gives you some real status in the animal kingdom, I would say. And the reason why I say this is because when you ask kids, it doesn't matter, any age, school-age kids, which is the coolest dinosaur, by a long shot, 85%, the T-Rex is the coolest dinosaur. And so there goes the chicken, right? This is important. So molecular evidence really ties this together now. Birds are derived from a group of bipedal dinosaurs. No questions about that. This is how it is. Now, along with these kinds of jumps in evolution, there are some interesting concepts that have an influence on our evolution. And that's why I want to bring some of these up. The first of these is called exaptation. And an exaptation is a structure that evolves in one context but becomes useful in another. I'm going to give you an example for this. As we've seen in this lineage, this evolutionary branch, if you will, that goes from something like a T-Rex to something like a chicken, you'll see the emergence of feathers. And at some point along the way, you see the emergence of flight. The two are unrelated in evolution. Feathers came first. Some of those large dinosaurs, like T-Rexes, their babies had feathers. So I'm not saying that the T-Rex had, you know, these huge fluffy feathers, or they were big feather balls or something like that. Not at all. Because the larger you get, the easier is it for you to keep your body temperature relatively high during the night. You have a lot of inertia when it comes to the loss of temperature. But when you're very small, and as a baby dinosaur, you may not have been able to pick up a lot of warmth on a day that will then take you through the night. To have some feathers for thermoregulation would be very important. On really cold nights, like tonight, like last night, this could be a matter of life and death. Therefore, it is something that natural selection can pick on and favor. So feathers, in the context of thermoregulation, are a great thing, just like feather duvets, for example, for us. Now, once you have these structures and a nice accumulation of them to really form like a nice layer of warmth over you, then one of the things that will happen is as you move, and in particular as you jump off of something, you're going to have a significant increase in drag around your body. It's going to be an effect not quite like a parachute, but it's going to help you make for a softer landing, or perhaps even as gliding in response to a predatory attack. So feathers evolved in the context of thermoregulation. That's where they conveyed a distinct advantage. But if they also help in gliding, now that becomes a matter of survival as well. So feathers as working in gliding, that is an exaptation. So feathers as insulation, that's the adaptation. And natural selection will favor a thicker set of feathers. Once the feathers reach a certain thickness, then they increase the drag so much that they act like a little parachute, and they allow you to glide. So feathers then, as gliding structures, they are an exaptation. They didn't evolve for that, but they evolved as insulation. They just could be used for gliding as well. And so that's the exaptation. Now, once you have strong, solid feathers that help in gliding, then it doesn't take much so that you get to modification for flying. That's sort of the next step, if you will. Now, to give you an example, think of your own hands. When you think of the hand of a human, it is clearly something that's excellent for grabbing things. And so the hand with an opposable thumb is something that evolved because it conveyed a distinct advantage to grab things and to hold on to things. Perhaps support of some sort, perhaps grabbing food. Now, in order to get a hand with an opposable thumb, all you have to do is move around some of the elements during development so that you can actually oppose the thumb. That's a developmental issue. It's not that hard to do. There are certain genes that make our hands, and in order to make one that actually has an opposable thumb is not really that difficult. So your thumb, in that context, is an adaptation for grasping things. Well, what are you using your thumb for? Maybe you're a musician. Maybe you're using it for typing. Maybe you use it for texting, for gaming. Those are all kinds of uses that have nothing to do with grasping anymore. Do you see the distinction? You've shifted the use of your thumb, not because you wanted to or because it was a matter of life and death, but simply because you choose to. And amongst humans, there are now more and more individuals who use their thumbs for those kind of things, right? Now, at this point in time, the use of your thumb does not appear to be something in these new ways does not appear something that would help you survive particularly or help you reproduce particularly. It's just a different use. But the moment that the thumb in these new uses becomes a matter of life and death, then natural selection kicks in and says, those individuals with a better ability to use their thumb for that instead of just for grasping, those will be the ones favored by selection. And that would then mean that the thumb in its new use is an exaptation. The adaptation is for grasping. Exaptation would be for texting or gaming or whatever. So this is an interesting concept, and we may see some kind of natural selection on the thumb in the future. In general, when it comes to these kinds of changes, these remodeling types of things, these remodeling steps in evolution, we look at developmental genes nowadays. This is one of the key areas where we find evolution and how it operates. Evolution literally uses developmental genes as tools for building different structures. And some of the building, some of the remodeling just involves slight changes in perhaps how long a gene is expressed or when exactly in development it occurs or over what area the products of that gene spread. All of this is collectively known as evo-devo, evolution development. And this is a study that really only began in the mid-1990s. So this is a relatively young field, but it's very powerful because it explains so many of the things that we see in evolution and how the steps between one kind of structure and another may have worked. Evo-devo helps us explain all of these. One example of this is a group of genes called Hox genes, H-O-X. And these Hox genes are a series of genes, so they're in different organisms, they're different numbers, but they're usually probably a dozen or so of these Hox genes, and they help lay in the basic structure and orientation of an organism. Orientation meaning where's the front, where's the back. Well, that's pretty fundamental, right? So obviously that has to happen relatively early during development. But then, what about all the structures? Things like arms and legs, front limbs, hind limbs, or things like tails. I mean, where do you put them? If you don't want a tail, well, you turn the gene off. If you want short limbs, you turn that gene off. And it is in fact possible to artificially knock out some of these genes. And people have been able to produce a variety of artificial mutant organism in which they knock out some of these genes to study what will happen if you knock out one of those genes in the cascade. And so here's an example for what happens if you knock out the one gene that makes antennae normally in a fruit fly. Well, what happens if you knock out that gene, there are no antennae produced, and instead of the antennae, you get a pair of legs on the head. Now, antennae in insects are segmented structures, just like the legs are. And so normally, you would produce the antennae, that's a sensory structure, but because the antenna gene isn't there, you actually end up with the wrong thing produced next in line on the head. Now, this is a kind of fly that can survive a certain amount of time, but it doesn't have the sensory input from the antennae, so it's not something that's going to survive particularly well in nature. It's not, the latest fashion to have your arms on your head. That's not what I'm advocating here. I'm just saying that it's simply a matter of having things in the right order or not. Knock something out, you can get some really big changes. And it turns out that this kind of thing also has an impact on us as humans. This concept is called pedomorphosis. Pedomorphosis means that the adult retains juvenile characteristics. And this thing here is called an axolotl. And an axolotl is basically a type of tiger salamander. They live in the deserts of Mexico in caves. And in this particular instance, the organisms that normally would metamorphose and turn into terrestrial salamanders did not metamorphose and remained in the water as larvae. Now let me give you a little primer of salamander biology. Salamanders are amphibians, and so normally you would have an egg develop into a salamander larva, and the salamander larvae live in lakes, streams, and ponds. And they have gills, just like this one does. And when they have reached a certain level in their development, metamorphosis kicks in. Metamorphosis is the same process that turns a caterpillar into a butterfly or a tadpole into a frog. So it's this fundamental shift in what the body does and how it works. New structures form, and it's obviously very comprehensive and complex. And in the case of salamanders, they will develop into terrestrial adults. Tiger salamander, that's a terrestrial kind of salamander. Now, in the case of these axolotls, it's a good thing for them that they didn't turn into terrestrial salamanders, because if they moved out into the habitat, out of the water, they would very quickly dry up, because the environment that they find themselves in would be desert and very inhospitable to an amphibian. And so it is thought that there was a salamander population that existed normally at a time when the area where this axolotl lives today was still some type of verdant forest or grassland or something like that. Well, as it dried up, only those salamanders with a developmental defect were able to survive. They survived because they did not metamorphose. So they did turn into adults. So sexual maturity worked, growth worked, but the hormones that make them into normal salamanders didn't show up. Something happened and those hormones never worked. So one way to test whether this is what happened is to, first of all, give one of these salamanders some of those hormones, right? And it turns out that some of these axolotls, they actually do respond to these hormones. So you give them the hormone, and they will start to reduce the gills, and they will turn into something like a terrestrial salamander. Now, it's been a while since they actually existed as terrestrial salamanders, so it's not a really nice working terrestrial salamander, but the point is, it's the hormones that got turned off. That's why you have these types of organisms. Now, they happen to live in caves. That's where the water is, and that's where the best habitat is, and so they've lost their pigmentation, and the eyes have become reduced. But other than that, they're just basically a tiger salamander. And it turns out when you look at pedomorphosis, pedomorphosis is also an important mechanism in human evolution. Humans, if you think about it, look remarkably like they're young. And here's an example for why I say that. If you look at this kind of diagram, you see that you basically have a square overlaid of the chimpanzee's skull. This is a chimpanzee fetus, and this is a chimpanzee adult. And the deformation of each of these squares shows how the development in these different parts of the skull progresses. So this square here is this field here. And clearly, this field is no longer a square, right? And so this is how you can see that there is a significant amount of morphological change in the skull of a chimpanzee between the young and the adult. Now, if you look at humans, you also see changes. But if you look at this and you say, oh yeah, that's a square, and you look at this, well, that's almost still a square. So compared to the shift between chimpanzee young and chimpanzee adult, the human condition is much more like the young. And that is therefore pedomorphosis, because pedomorphosis, remember, was that the adult retains the features of the young. And we clearly do in terms of our overall skull shape. So those are the kind of things that are really interesting when it comes to the overall morphology. But there's also some direct evidence from genes now. One of the questions that people have asked for a long time is, how can you say that humans evolved from monkeys? That kind of thing. That's what you hear when people want to discuss evolution and they don't really have the necessary information. Nobody says that humans evolved from monkeys. What it is that primates have a common ancestor, and humans are included in the animal group called primates. We don't have tails. We share that characteristic with, for example, gibbons, with chimpanzees, with orangutans, and with gorillas. Those are the other primates that are tailless, and that's what we call ape. And so when you look at some of the more finite characteristics, such as jaw musculature, and then you find out which gene is actually responsible for the development of that jaw musculature, you find that in primates, it's the same gene. The gene is called MYH16, and it turns out that it produces some very strong jaw muscles in non-human primates. So chimps, gorillas, orangutans have a set of formidable jaw muscles, very strong ability to chew and break things with their teeth. Humans, in contrast, have a very weak set of muscles. Now I want you to follow along with me for a minute as we discover our jaw muscles. These are the muscles involved in opening and closing the lower jaw. So, open your jaw and close it and feel where the muscles are. You can clearly feel that there are muscles moving. Now, when you go to your cheekbone, those muscles are not there because they actually go underneath this thing here. This is called the zygomatic arch. Your muscles go through the center of this, underneath the bone. And then they come back out over here. On your temples, you can clearly feel your jaw muscles. And as you move further up your skull, you'll find that, okay, at some point, I'm losing them. Right around sort of here is where you no longer feel the movement of the muscles. So the movement of the muscles stops. Right on top, you do not feel your jaw muscles. In a chimpanzee or a gorilla or an orangutan, if you touch their head, you will find that it's muscles. You pat them on the head, it's muscles. The only thing that's not muscle is a ridge in the middle of the skull called the cranial crest, and that's where some of these muscles attach. So they have really strong muscles that form right over the skull. And we don't have that. We don't have that. And the reason that why we don't have this is because of that mutation. So our development of jaw muscles is produced by a mutated, weaker version, if you will, of MYH16. All right, well, what does it matter? I mean, normally you would expect if an organism has a weakness in a muscle that helps it eat, that would be a really bad thing. I mean, clearly natural selection would say, whoa, you can't really use your jaws for cracking open bones and for extracting bone marrow and for various kinds of things. It's not that good, really. So I guess natural selection is going to work against you, and you should eventually go extinct. But here we are. And there they are, those apes with their large muscles. So what happened? Well, it turns out that as long as you have this really important muscle over the top of your skull, that means your skull can't grow. Natural selection would not favor a bigger skull. Natural selection would favor stronger muscles, because that is what gives you your advantage. And so this defect is actually a problem. But if you have people with the defect, or individuals with the defect, who somehow can figure out how to get around that defect by being a little bit smarter about how to get food, by perhaps foraging using tools, then you can regain that advantage and ultimately increase your advantage, because it turns out, a bigger brain is more important than big jaw muscles. Now, that's an experiment. You don't know this until natural selection acts on it and favors it. But because of us being here in this room and the other primates being out there in diminishing numbers, guess which natural selection ultimately did favor? Obviously favored us, right? Now, it turns out that this mutation in MYH16 was timed by using a molecular clock approach, how these changes and sequences accumulate over time, and it was timed to about between 5 and 7 million years ago. So that means about 5 or 7 million years ago, this mutation made us diverge from the branch with all the other primates, all the other non-human primates. And so this is what our branch is now. 5 to 7 million years ago is when we would have been on the same branch. And so if you're looking for the common ancestor, that individual or those individuals would have to have lived about 5 to 7 million years ago. And it turns out that there is a hominid skull that approximately fits that time frame. And it was a skull that was literally found because somebody was walking along and stubbed their toe on it. Well, that's how the story goes anyway. And it was sticking out, and there it was. Sahelanthropus is what they called it. The Sahel in reference to the Sahara Desert, that's the Sahel zone. Anthropus, anthropology, right? So there's the name, and that fossil has some features that are similar to that of, let's say, a chimpanzee, similar to some of the features that we have in the human skull, but it has a little cranial crest still. But the muscles don't appear to have inserted anymore in that cranial crest. So that cranial crest is there, but it's a remnant. And it doesn't have any of the marks that you would see if a muscle actually inserts on the bone. And so this was a remarkable case to be made for where perhaps some of the origins of humans lay. So it's very interesting to look at that.